In the gray, waterlogged autumn of 2003, a 26-year-old Grace Ellery stood at the fence line of a property that her own real estate agent had warned her not to buy. He'd said it gently, the way you warn someone not to order the fish at a questionable restaurant. He'd said it twice. She bought it anyway. The land was 40 acres of what locals in the Annapolis Valley called the Drowned Fields, a wide, low-lying stretch of former farmland outside Kentville, Nova Scotia, that had been quietly surrendering to the tidal backwash of the Cornwallis River for the better part of 2 decades. The previous owner, a man named Earl Pittman, whose family had farmed the valley since before Confederation, had tried blueberries, then hay, then simply given up and let the land go fallow. The grass that grew there was the coarse, salt-tolerant kind that nothing much wanted to eat. The soil, when you crouched and picked it up, smelled of iron and brine and old defeat. Earl Pittman shook Grace's hand on the day of closing with the firm, relieved grip of a man setting down a very heavy bag. "You're getting character," he told her, which is what Maritimers say when they mean good luck with that. Grace had driven the 3 hours from Halifax with a cashier's draft and a wooden box her grandmother had left her. The draft she handed to the notary. The box she kept in the passenger seat the whole way, the way you'd keep company on a long drive. Her grandmother, Nora Ellery, had been a quietly extraordinary woman. She had farmed a strip of land near the Minas Basin for 50 years, land the Agricultural Extension Office had always described, politely, as challenging. Nora had never used the word challenging. She used the word interesting. She farmed not against the tidal salt flats, but with them. Learning over decades which plants could handle the brackish soil, which grasses could hold a dike, how the timing of the tides interacted with the frost calendar, how the geese that passed through in October left behind something the soil needed in spring. She kept journals, dense, unhurried journals with hand-drawn maps of water levels, observation notes about which sections greened up first, what grew where the seagrass had laid down the previous year. She had left Grace the journals, a second-hand pair of rubber hip waders, and 2 pieces of advice written on a card tucked inside the front cover of the first volume. Don't fight the water, and never trust a straight ditch. Grace had been a horticulture graduate working at a nursery in Dartmouth. She was good at her job and bored of it in the specific, restless way that happens when you know you're capable of something you haven't done yet. The nursery sold potted herbs and seasonal annuals. She had wanted to grow things that mattered, so she bought Earl Pittman's Drowned Fields for $62,000, which was almost everything she had. And she stood at that fence line in the October cold and tried to see what her grandmother would have seen. What everyone else saw was obvious enough. The neighbors on the adjacent farms, the Thorne family to the north, who grew heritage apples, and Miss Caldwell to the south, a retired dairy farmer with opinions about most things, saw a sodden mess of cordgrass and standing water and bad drainage. They saw what had defeated the Pittman family and the family before them. They saw, if they were being honest over coffee at the co-op in Kentville, a young woman from the city who had mistaken stubbornness for strategy. Mr. Caldwell said his piece directly, which was his nature. He leaned on the fence post the first week she was there, while she was walking the property lines with her grandmother's journals under one arm. "Your drainage is finished," he told her, gesturing to the low center of the property where the ground simply held water like a clay bowl. "Tidal intrusion's been working at this for 20 years. That soil's got salt in it 6 inches down. Nothing you plant there's going to pay you back." He paused, looked at the journals under her arm with the mild suspicion rural men reserve for written things. "What are you thinking of doing with it?" Grace had looked out at the gray-green water sitting in the bowl of the low field, and the math she was going to keep to herself. "Samphire," she said. "Samphire," she said. He blinked. "The weed, the vegetable," she said, "and some other things." He shook his head slowly as he walked back to his truck. It was not an unkind gesture. It was the head shake of a man who has watched the valley humble better-funded operations than one young woman with a pair of waiters and a family recipe box. Let me explain what Grace had seen that Mr. Caldwell had not. He had looked at the salt-compromised soil and seen destruction. She had looked at the same soil and seen selection. The tidal intrusion hadn't ruined the land. It had been quietly sorting it, washing away what couldn't handle salt, concentrating minerals, creating a particular kind of ground that most crops despised and a very specific category of plants absolutely required. Her grandmother's journals had a section Grace had read so many times the pages had gone soft at the corners. Nora had written it in the winter of 1987, after a storm surge had briefly salted 3 acres of her own fields. The neighbors had told her to cut her losses. Instead, she had left the fields alone for 1 season and watched what grew. Glasswort came first, then sea purslane, then a sparse, determined showing of marsh samphire, what the French settlers had once called salicorn, what the old Acadian farmers had pickled and eaten through the winters. "The salt doesn't destroy," Nora had written in her careful, unhurried hand. "It narrows, it tells the land what it is. Once you know what the land is, you can decide what belongs there. Most people try to change what the land is. That is a very expensive argument to lose." Samphire, sea bean, glasswort, call it what you will, had been showing up on the menus of high-end Halifax restaurants for 2 years by the time Grace bought the property. Chefs loved it. It was crunchy and briny and tasted of the ocean in a way that was fashionable and specific. The supply was coming entirely from wild harvest, which was unreliable and seasonal. There was no commercial cultivated source in Atlantic Canada. Grace knew this because she had spent 3 months before the purchase calling every restaurant supplier between Yarmouth and Sydney. Not one of them could get her consistent, cultivated samphire. But that was only half of what she had seen. The other half she had read in a paper published by the Dalhousie Agricultural Faculty, a dry document full of tables and footnotes that most people would have closed before the second page. It described the way samphire in managed tidal flats functioned as a pioneer species. It came in first. It stabilized the soil with its root mass. It began reducing the surface salinity as it drew salt up into its tissues and died back each winter, leaving the ground slightly less compromised than it had found it. Farmed properly, in careful rotation, a salted field planted with samphire could theoretically begin to remediate itself. The salt drew the samphire reduced the salt. Every harvest cycle nudged the outer edges of the flooded zone towards something more ordinary, something that could, in time, grow other things. It was not a fast plan. It was not the kind of plan you could pitch to a bank. Grace pitched it to the bank anyway. The agricultural loan officer at the credit union in Kentville was a man named Mr. Henderson. He wore a lanyard with his name on it, and a look of careful patience that people in his position develop over years of hearing ideas from farmers. He listened to Grace's full presentation, the samphire market, the remediation timeline, the Dalhousie research, with his fingers flat on the desk and his expression arranged into neutral attentiveness. When she finished, he said, "There's no precedent for commercial samphire cultivation in this region." "That's why there's market for it," Grace said. He tilted his head. "The remediation timeline you're describing is 8 to 12 years before the outer fields are viable for conventional crops." "Yes, and your revenue in years 1 through 3 comes entirely from samphire sales to restaurant suppliers, sadias, and direct-to-consumer farmers markets." specialty grocers. He looked at his desk for a moment. Mrs. Ellery, the property has no existing infrastructure. The drainage is compromised. The soil test we'd require would likely come back unusable for most purposes. The bank's position on unimproved wetland property in this county. I know your position, Grace said. She was not rude about it. She had her grandmother's way of being direct without being sharp. I'm asking you to consider that the wetland isn't a problem I'm trying to fix. It's the thing I'm farming. He looked at her for a moment longer than was quite comfortable. Then he said, regretfully, that the risk profile of the project was outside what the institution could support at this time. She thanked him and left. She had expected the answer. She sold her car and her good camera and called in a favor from a cousin in Truro who owed her money from a long time ago. It wasn't enough, but it was a start. But now let me stop here and ask you something. Have you ever had a plan that you couldn't fully explain to anyone? Not because it was unclear in your own mind, but because the explanation required them to first unlearn something they were certain of. Have you ever stood in the specific loneliness of knowing something that no one around you can yet see? That was Grace's world in the first 2 years. The plan lived entirely inside her and her grandmother's journals and the soft pages of a Dalhousie research paper she kept folded in the back pocket of her waders. The first planting was in April of 2004. She had sourced starter cuttings from a marine biology contact at NSCAD who was growing samphire in a research context and thought commercial cultivation was an interesting, if improbable, idea. Grace planted by hand, alone, wading through the cold, brackish water of the main tidal flat in her grandmother's hip waders, pressing each cutting into the clay-heavy ground at regular intervals, while the red-winged blackbirds argued in the cordgrass around her. The Thorne family, apple orchardists who had farmed the adjacent land for 4 generations, watched with the polite bewilderment of people watching someone rearrange furniture in a burning room. Their eldest son, who was Grace's age and had the easy, settled confidence of someone who had always known what he was going to do with his life, asked her once what the green stuff was she was planting. "Sea beans," she said. "People eat that? Chefs in Halifax are paying $18 for 100 grams of it." He laughed, the uncomplicated laugh of someone who cannot imagine a world where that is true, and went back to his trees. That first summer was a long, wet lesson in patience. The samphire took slowly, a thin green blush appearing across the tidal flat by late June, sparse and unconvincing. Her first harvest in August was enough to fill 2 coolers. She drove them to Halifax herself, to a restaurant on Barrington Street, whose chef had answered her email with cautious interest. He tasted a stem and looked at her with the expression chefs wear when they are trying not to show they are pleased. "It's clean," he said. "It's consistent. Can you do this every week?" She said yes, which was half true. She could do it some weeks. She was going to have to figure out the other weeks. The revenue from that first year was not enough to live on with any comfort. It was enough to prove the plant would grow, enough to buy more cuttings for the following spring, enough to cover her property taxes and a modest debt repayment. She supplemented by taking weekend shifts at a nursery in Windsor. She ate a lot of eggs. She didn't talk about the finances to anyone because the finances were the kind of numbers that end conversations. The second year, she expanded to 12 acres. The third year, 16. She had mapped the property the way her grandmother had mapped hers, by walking it in different seasons, by watching where the water moved, by learning the specific character of each section's soil. The lowest, most persistently flooded acres stayed in samphire. The areas on the margin of the tidal influence, where the salt was present but not dominant, she began experimenting with sea lavender and marsh marigold. She found a florist in Wolfville who would take everything she grew of the lavender. She found that the marsh marigold, which her grandmother had noted in the journals but never pursued commercially, had an audience at the weekend market in Kentville that surprised her every Saturday. Something else was happening that she hadn't fully predicted from the Dalhousie paper, or rather hadn't dared count on. The soil on the outer edges of the cultivation zone was changing. The samphire was doing its quiet remediation work. By the third growing season, she was taking soil samples every 6 weeks, and the numbers in the margin zones were moving. The electrical conductivity, the measure of salt content, was dropping by measurable increments in sections that had been continuously planted. The ground was becoming something other than what Earl Pittman had sold her. It was becoming, slowly and without drama, arable. She didn't tell anyone this yet. The numbers were too early. She'd learned not to say things she couldn't yet show. In the 5th year, something shifted in the community's tone. Not dramatically. In small towns, things shift the way the tide moves. You don't see it happening, and then suddenly, the water is somewhere different than it was. The restaurant supplier in Halifax called to say he had a second client asking for her samphire specifically. A new place that had heard about it from the first, a food writer from a Halifax paper, came to the farm and published a small piece about Atlantic Sea vegetables and mentioned Grace and the property. Mr. Caldwell, who read the paper cover to cover every day of his retirement, appeared at her fence post one morning with 2 cups of coffee from the Tim Hortons in town. "Saw the piece," he said, handing her one. "Thanks for coming by," she said. He looked out over the fields, which by then had a visible order to them. The deep green rows of samphire in the low flat, the purple haze of sea lavender on the margins, the reclaimed outer sections where she had recently quietly put in a test plot of heritage oats. "The oats," he said, after a moment. That's the land that was underwater 4 years ago." "It is." He was quiet for a long time, the way men of his generation are quiet when they're recalibrating. "How'd you do that?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "I didn't," Grace said. "The samphire did. I just let it." He drank his coffee and said nothing else about it, which in the Annapolis Valley is the same thing as saying quite a lot. By 2011, 8 years after Grace had stood at Earl Pittman's fence line with a cashier's draft and a wooden box, the farm had become something the county agricultural office had quietly begun to document. Not because it was famous, because it was anomalous. The property tax assessment had been revised upward twice. The soil maps had to be redrawn. The outer fields that had been classified as permanent wetland unsuitable for cultivation had been reclassified. 22 acres of land that had been functionally worthless when Grace bought it were now producing heritage oats, and, in the most recently reclaimed section, the beginning of a market garden. She was running 3 revenue streams by then: the restaurant samphire, the florist lavender, and the direct market sales of whatever the outer fields were giving her that season. She had hired 2 people part-time, local women who lived nearby, and had learned the harvest schedules. She had paid off the property. She had not taken on debt to do any of it. The man from the credit union, Mr. Henderson, retired in 2009. His replacement, a younger woman named Ms. Arsenault, who had studied agricultural finance at Acadia University, called Grace in the spring of 2012 to ask if she would be willing to speak at a regional lenders workshop about non-traditional Atlantic farm operations. "We're trying to understand," Ms. Arsenault said, with the directness Grace had always appreciated in people who were new to something and knew it, "why the models we use don't account for what you've done. The land value increase alone it's unusual." Grace thought about that. "The models assume the problem is the land," she said. I started from the assumption that the land knew what it was doing, that I was the one who needed to catch up. There was a pause on the line. Yes, that's roughly what I was hoping you'd say. Would you be willing to come talk to a room full of loan officers? Grace said she would. She brought her grandmother's journals. She left them on the table at the front of the room, not as props, but because they were the real beginning of the story, and she thought the room should see that. The thing about vindication, when it actually arrives, is that it is quieter than you expect. There is no single moment where the people who doubted you stand in a row and acknowledge they were wrong. It happens instead in small increments. It happens in a phone call from a journalist, in a revised soil map, in Mr. Caldwell showing up with 2 coffees, in the way your name is said differently at the co-op than it was said 8 years before. You don't notice the shift while it's happening. You only recognize it looking backward, the way you can see the shape of a wave only once it's passed. Grace Ellery never bought more land than she could walk in an afternoon. She never chased the kind of scale that requires a loan you can feel in your sleep. By 2015, the farm ran at a profit margin that agricultural economists who visited described, in papers, as structurally unusual and difficult to replicate through conventional models, which she understood to mean that the math looked wrong to people who were using the wrong math. The farmers in the valley didn't come to her all at once. They came one at a time, the way people come. When they need to learn something, they're slightly embarrassed not to already know. They asked about her drainage approach, about her soil testing schedule, about the samphire varieties. She told them everything. She had no interest in keeping it to herself. The whole philosophy, her grandmother's philosophy really, only made sense if it spread. If you drive through the Annapolis Valley now, and you know what you're looking for, you'll see it. You'll see field margins planted with sea lavender, where there used to be nothing but couch grass and fence posts. You'll see the white cards of restaurant suppliers attached to bins at the Saturday market, specifying which farm the samphire came from. You'll see a particular kind of farm where the land is doing more than one thing at once, where the wet section and the dry section are both earning, where the farmer is working with the character of the land rather than against it. A quiet idea, carried in a wooden box from a small farm near the Minas Basin, is now part of how this corner of Nova Scotia thinks about soil. On a clear September evening, if you happen to pass the right farm lane outside Kentville, you might see a woman in her mid-40s sitting on the steps of a small farmhouse with a girl beside her. Her niece, who drives up from Dartmouth most weekends now, who has started asking the right questions, who has started carrying a journal of her own. The woman is pointing to a passage in an old notebook, the handwriting faded and elegant, the margins filled with small maps of water and light. She is not teaching the girl a farming technique. She is teaching her a way of paying attention. She is handing her the only thing that had ever mattered, the quiet, stubborn ability to look at a field everyone else had given up on and see what it was asking for. Earl Pittman had seen a drowned field. The bank had seen an unsecured liability. The neighbors had seen a young woman making a very expensive mistake. But the land, the patient, salt-scored, quietly knowing land, had seen something else entirely. It had seen someone who was willing to listen before she spoke. Someone who understood that the first step to growing anything is to stop arguing with the ground beneath your feet and start learning its language instead.